This panel will focus, the first panel was really focused on the WPS sort of globally. This panel will focus on how the WPS agenda has fared in different regions of the world. How has it been implemented in the Americas, Africa, and the Middle East, as well as Europe? And what can we learn from these different regional perspectives? And what does the future look like in these different regions? And to help us in the discussion, we have a terrific panel with two people here in the room with me and two people on the screen. So in the room is Joan Johnson-Fries. She is a senior fellow at WISE and an adjunct professor at Harvard University, where she teaches courses on women, peace and security, leadership issues, and US national security. She's also taught at the Naval War College. She's published very widely on national security issues, including very widely on WPS issues. And her most recent book deals with masculine and feminine leadership in war and peace. Next to Joan is Ninar Fawal, Program Manager and Research Associate of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to CSIS, you worked at the Carnegie Endowment as well as the London School of Economics and Politics. On the screen, we have Fawzia Abdi Ali. She is the founder and president of Women in International Security, Horn of Africa. She also chairs a regional network of women peace builders in the Horn of Africa. I've known Fawzia for quite some years. She's a very active bridge builder between civil society on the one hand and governmental agencies in Kenya and Africa more generally on the other. And she's done also a lot of work on preventing violent extremism. And then last but not least, we have Alexandra Gassold, who is the Secretary General of WISE Poland and professor of political science at the University of Warsaw. Alexandra has also published widely on security issues, most notably on terrorism issues, the issues related to hybrid warfare. And she is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Cybersecurity and Internet Governance. So this is a fantastic panel and also a very interesting panel because you all come from very diverse, different backgrounds. What I would like to do is to have 2 rounds of questions with the panelists here and then open it up for questions and answers. Now, I'd like to start with you, Fawzia, because, it's often forgotten that African women and African civil society have been actually central to the creation of the WPS agenda and have really shaped its development. But as somebody said, if you look today, the WPS agenda in Africa stands both as an achievement and a contested project. There's a little bit of a disconnect between, say, African Union policies on the WPS agenda on gender equality on the one hand, and the lived realities of women. And so I wonder if you could, comment on that and give us a very brief sense of where you think the WPS agenda stands in Africa. Over to you.
Thank you, Chantal. I hope I'm audible. Good afternoon. It's actually evening here. Good morning. I know it's still morning in DC. And Jambo from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you for having me participate at really this important conversation. I was able to catch a little bit in the first panel. And really looking forward to the conversation we have also during our session. So Chantal, as you said, yes, sometimes people forget that the WPS agenda in itself, the champion that actually was amongst those who were able to push the 1325 at the time. The WPS in itself, we like to say in Africa that it was born here, because long before we had 1325 in the year 2000 and so on, women were already shaping peace in ways I think most places were barely noticing. If you look at cases like Liberia, they were building interfaith coalitions at the time that helped end a civil war. If you come to countries like Somalia, they were at the peak of what we'd call warlords, but you'd still see women elders negotiating for local ceasefires. So there were a lot of informal peace talks that were also happening that were not necessarily being recognized across the board. So the WPS became an achievement for African women because it legitimized what women were already doing. It gave it that political language to what I would say was their invisible labor of peace. Yes, it is still contested if we look at it now, because it entered the institutional frameworks, and this is where we started seeing it lose what I would call its radical power. When you look at the African Union in itself is really extraordinary. It has done remarkable and built a lot of remarkable architectures. We have the Continental Results Framework. We have FEMWISE Africa, which is a group of women working on mediation. We have open sessions on WPS at the Peace and Security Council. So really, when it comes to the frameworks, we've really been able to adopt 1325 and its subsequent resolutions and turned them into programs and projects that the AU itself has been leading. So where is the contention? Why is it not, I would say, not really reaching home? Is the fact that it's a little bit moved away from what I call lived realities of women. So the AU architectures, the AU different frameworks that has come into play to look at monitoring and evaluation and so on, there's a bit of a distance between commitment and the change we want to see. And most of this is driven by the fact that the documents are still beautiful on paper. We turned what I call the national action plans into checklists, right? We want to write really beautiful written documentations. We hold meetings. Africa, and especially if you look at East African countries like Uganda, are hailed as having one of the most robust national action plans on 1325. And we fill these reports. We try and bring it down to the grassroots levels. But what is usually missing is they are poorly financed. And at the end of the day, without really that money to even translate some of these national action plans into local languages, then it really misses the value that you can actually see from it moving from really high level areas to now really into communities, away from like AU in Addis to places like Garissa, where you want women to also understand the national action plan in the language that they really hold dear. And so that disconnect between higher level and the lower levels actually takes away from the impetus the WPS was supposed to do. And then secondly, there was also that radical shifting of power. Just because we started losing, I would say, the political legitimacy and language that we really needed to keep going with the WPS. I think we moved away from that. When you look at some of the engagements we have, and this is in particular if we bring in the question of CVE, it became an effort for women to help with stabilization. So we moved away from women even being part of really political processes, and we changed a little bit the agencies of women. It took away from even the other lived realities. We still had displacement. We still had climate-related shocks and its implications, especially to families and in particular women and children. in those communities. We now have what I call the challenge of social media and the digital age that is also coming to play. We see more violence geared towards women. So we could see the disconnect coming in, the fact that it was not able to speak to the realities that were evolving over time. I have to put in the caveat at the time, because if you look at the genesis of national action plans in particular, they came into effect in places like the Horn between the year 2010 and the year 2028. And this was the period we really had high levels of attacks, terrorist attacks. We had the Westgate attacks. We had the university, Garissa University, being attacked and over 167 students being killed. So it was at the heart of the challenges that we were facing at that time, and so it's almost overshadowed the rest of the challenges that we were facing. But at the end of the day, even though it gave the WPS agenda the much needed maybe resources and the advocacy it needed, it took away from most of what was the reality at the time. So back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Let me switch here to the room, and I want to turn to you, Joan, and have you talk a little bit about the Americas. I think in the first panel we saw that, you know, the US governmental track is kind of dead. But it might be good to recall that in the US, actually, we had, you know, relative strong supporter in the military at the time of WPS. And how the US military, and I see you have a notebook of US Southern Command, and how US Southern Command has actually used a lot of its relationships with countries in Latin America to further the WPS agenda. So your thoughts?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me as a non-Washingtonian. It's a real honor for me to be among some of the Washington icons of women, peace, and security. And to see so many students here, because a lot of us were first, but you're next, and you're coming up quickly. I was the first woman department chair at the Naval War College, where I was on the faculty for 22 years in a very male-dominated environment. In fact, I'm going to start by giving a little anecdote that tells what I think is a primary problem that we're facing. And that was in 2012, I was a faculty member at the Naval War College. I just stepped down from being chaired the National Security Studies Department, and I was asked to go to a Women, Peace, and Security conference. A colleague and I politely declined. I thought, what could this conference offer to me, a woman doing security studies for 20 years? The next year I was invited again, and pretty much as a professional courtesy, I went and totally changed the arc of my career after that. It connected all the dots of everything I had been doing. But my point is, I was a woman teaching security studies in a military institution. I'd never heard of women, peace, and security. And I would argue that at the time I retired 2 years ago from the Naval War College, it was entirely possible to receive an MA in security studies there and never have heard of women, peace, and security, or at least not have any understanding of it. So I think we have a knowledge problem. And that carried over to the carrying out of the Women, Peace, and Security Act in the United States. You know, 1325 was passed in 2000, but we didn't have our first action plan until 11 years later. It wasn't that we jumped right on the bandwagon. And then when the act was passed in 2017, and over about 18 months, finally the Defense Department got a strategy for implementation. The military is very good at compliance, but compliance can range from box checking to substantive action. I don't think the military was eagerly embracing women, peace, and security. It was more or less accepting that it had to do something. And what happened really varied between services, among commands, et cetera. Part of that is because there were kind of three things going on as part of the strategy. And the first was domestic acceptance. And at that time, where the military was regarding women was moving from integration to inclusion. The military is integrated. There are very few units in the military that are integrated, but that's not the same as inclusive. And the difference being integration says, we'll let you in. inclusion says we recognize your value and we, the institution, will change to make your value welcomed and accelerated. So that's where we were at that time. So that was one thing going on. And there were a lot of cultural barriers to that. And one of the more effective approaches to dealing with cultural barriers, as was talked about in the last panel, was appeal to the boss. What's this going to do for the boss? And there was an Air Force, a woman Air Force general, who came up with a business case. It's called the 5 R's. And it basically said, if you're looking for the best person for a job, which theoretically you are, then you want to expand recruitment. So that's the first R. And you want to be inclusive because that keeps retention. And if you keep retention, you don't have to spend resources on retraining, and you are prepared and ready to carry out your mission with low risk. So they did those kind of things. The second was there was a big part of the strategy that dealt with dealing with partner nations, doing things over there. That was what was well accepted. That was what was embraced, because we wanted to work in Latin America, getting more women into the military. We worked very strong in Africa, doing things like legal clinics, building in civil liberties, civil rights, and more recently in Indo-PACOM, a lot of activity generated there. The third part of that was U.S. military and operations. And going back to the knowledge piece, you can't execute what you don't know about. And there were just so many individuals that had no idea what women, peace, and security was. This is where they had to be convinced. This is where they had to be convinced through pointing out women get access. Women have information and perspectives. And women can add to problem solving. And the example I often use, any of you seen the documentary Guerrera? You haven't, I recommend it. And it's about the women cultural support team members in Afghanistan who went out with the special operations groups. And in it, there's a woman named Mary Kohler, and Mary told me the story that she used to go out on missions with special forces, and these were kicked down the door missions at night. And these were specially trained women, and when she would go out, she put Beanie Babies in her pocket. And the men laughed at her, but she just put them in, and she was out on a mission one night, and the men were talking to the men, and her job was to talk to the women and children, to keep them calm. And things were not going well. Things could have escalated very quickly. And there was a little boy, and she knelt down and she talked to him. She gave him a Beanie Baby. And he calmed down, and she stood up, and things were escalating and back. And they were out that night looking for weapons. And she felt a tug on her hand. And it was the little boy. And he took her hand and led her over to the guns. Said, here they are. Everybody went home safe and sound, totally de-escalated the entire situation. So this is what women can do in operations, but those who are believers are the ones who have seen it. So that was a third part. But my final point here is going back again to the knowledge. Women, peace, and security has a branding problem. It is very easy for resistors to conflate women, peace, and security with DEI. And the assumption is it's all about women. It is pacifist. It is all these, it's woke. It's very simply, it's woke. So we have a knowledge problem, and that's where a lot of the cultural resistance comes. And I think within the military, within the security community broader, part of that comes from not just lack of education within our professional military educations, but I found out this morning, very happily, that here at GW, gender is woven into international relations courses. That is not always the case. It is too often the case that you can get a degree, an advanced degree in international relations, and never hear about the role of gender and security. And I think we have a big job in if you're going to do a movement, people have to know about us. They have to know what it's about. So
Okay, thank you. Nina, I want to come to you, and you're an expert in the Middle East. The Middle East is not known for having adopted the WPS agenda, broadly. There are very few national action plans, yet the League of Arab States has adopted a regional action plan on WPS. And lately, we have seen some of the Gulf states, like United Arab Emirates, adopting an app. But it seems to me that a lot of the focus there is really on women's economic empowerment. Can you maybe explain and comment a little bit on how WPS is lived there?
Definitely. Thank you, Weiss, for having me. First of all, I'm very happy to see a lot of young women in the room. The Middle East, and particularly the Gulf, has been under the spotlight recently. The Gulf usually positively. There have been immense strides in women's empowerment in the Gulf, mainly economically, like you noted, Chantal, but also politically. But we can get into that later as to how meaningful that is. But the UAE specifically has been a leader in women's empowerment. Women comprise 54% of the workforce and make up 70% of university graduates. There are also political quotas in place, so women hold 50% of seats in the Federal National Council, which is one of their legislative bodies, or at least a forum for public debate about legislation. And that was after a directive by the then president, Sheikh Khalifa. This makes them have the highest rate of female parliamentary representation in the Arab world. So the UAE has been very much a leader on that, and I think they have marketed themselves to be a leader in that, which is why I say they are generally received quite positively in the US and increasingly internationally. In Oman, we've seen huge jumps in women's literacy rate. In Qatar, the participation rate for women in the workforce is 63%. These are just some numbers, but I think the most radical change that we all know of is Saudi Arabia. Um, Saudi Arabia saw immense social, economic, to some extent, political transformation after the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ascended to power. We've seen changes like the lifting of the ban on women driving. We've seen the introduction of anti-harassment laws. We've seen minor amendments to personal status laws, which allows women greater flexibility to operate without male guardianship. Um, and generally, like you said, Chantal, economically, women own 45% of SMEs in Saudi Arabia, and labor force participation is slowly but steadily rising. I think it sits at 34% at the moment. So it's clear that women's economic empowerment, particularly, is underpinned by these various visions we see in the region, like Vision 2030, which is Saudi Arabia's vision for social, political, economic transformation, but also Vision 2040 for Oman, and just generally a new type of political reinvigoration and social transformation that we're seeing in the Gulf. However, the elephant in the room is that while women's economic empowerment is heralded through what we can call state feminism, a very top-down approach, there's been a undeniable deepening of authoritarianism in the Gulf and in the region as a whole, particularly after the Arab Spring. So, for example, in Saudi Arabia, what's ironic is at the same time that they lifted the ban on women driving, they had a crackdown on women's movements in Saudi Arabia. You may have heard of the famous activist Lujan Hatlul. She was arrested, detained recently, got out of prison. In the UAE, political organizations are not even allowed. So we exist in a very tense environment where it is really propagated and it is really, I think, encouraged and supported at the top level nationally. But there's absolutely no room for organic, maybe, civil society. And the ones that are continuing to work face increasingly perilous circumstances. This is reflected in the rest of the Arab world. Uh, Women's formal political participation in the Arab world is one of the lowest in the world. But I want to stress that formal political participation is not our only measure of women, peace, and security and women's political participation. In the several conflicts that we've seen in the region in the last 20 years, women have been practicing WPS on the ground organically, whether that's through activism during the Arab Spring, leading sit ins, protests, forming coordination committees, forming local councils, responding to community needs and emergency and providing emergency response. I think we can sometimes be caught in formal representation, which is increasingly difficult in a region like the Middle East, where there is not much there's not much room to maneuver democratically for anybody, let alone women. But I think, ironically, in conflict zones, there is slightly bit more room to operate for women. As we know, women in conflict zones are able to break free of traditional gender roles, whether that's because the totality of war is able to suspend these gender norms, or men quite literally leaving or being killed or being detained as prisoners of war. So ironically, in conflict zones, we have seen political participation. In more quote unquote stable countries in the Gulf, it's been stifled, and increasingly so.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to turn to Alexandra. Can she hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Alexandra, Europe has, of course, motor behind movement towards gender equality and the WPS agenda. Europe is also a continent where we see a lot of national action plans. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, is there some differentiation in terms of the national action plans in Europe? And where do you see us at this particular moment? And then maybe we go to the future. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. And yes, the European Union has been a driving force. However, I don't see the chances anymore for further development because of very strong militarization of security, especially in my region, so in the Central European states. Though we have gender action plan, it's a third plan for the European Union. It was adopted 5 years ago, and it will last till the end of 2027. And we have also the EU action plan on human rights and democracy, and strategic compass for security and defense. And in those documents is also WPS agenda underlined. However, we don't have on the EU level WPS agenda integrated in Digital Service Act and the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation. I'm an expert within the EU Knowledge Hub on prevention, polarization, and radicalization, and we are talking there during our sessions about gender-based disinformation, and we want to force our governments on the national level and the EU European Commission to put this fragile issue also in the gender action plan. However, when we look at the national implementation, of course, many EU countries, they have adopted national action plan, but they haven't prolonged them and implemented new ones. Only Nordic countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark have got new national action plan with focus on cybersecurity as well, and also conflict-related sexual violence. However, Hungary hasn't adopted a national action plan at all, and in Poland, the national action plan has had expired 2 years ago. So in much of Central and Eastern Europe, including my own region, the WPS framework is still treated as a soft humanitarian issue rather than a strategic pillar of security. Of course, it is interrelated with Russian-Ukrainian war and the right-wing backlash that threatens progress. However, I always hear in my country, in Czech, in Slovakia, in Romania, in Balkan states, that WPS agenda is some kind of ideology, not approach or perspective towards security. And the good example of it is that on March this year, I was a speaker at the Foreign Affairs Committee of Polish Parliament, and it was a historic session devoted to women, peace and security agenda. And during this session, I have experience from Polish politicians and online hostility and online hate. And it was only a session. So it was a huge disappointment for wise Poland as well. However, what needs to be updated, as I mentioned before, gender-based disinformation, it's a huge challenge targeting women leaders, journalists, peace builders with online hate and manipulation. We have seen this clearly in Russian war against Ukraine, and it's very popular before the elections in each EU country. And the second issue is conflict-related gender-based violence, which continues to be used as a tactic of wars. In some NEIPs, like in Nordic countries, these issues are there. However, in Poland, we need to elaborate new procedures and new roadmap for national action plan. However, I observe also in Brussels during talks in the European Commission and in other committees that security is nowadays viewed only through a militarized lens. We have lost sight of what peace truly means, that in the center of security are human beings and communities, not only states. So every day we forget what doesn't mean resilience, society resilience. I think that I observe it as political scientist and also as an expert in many bodies in my country and at the European level.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm sorry to hear that also the governmental track in Europe is sort of stagnating. And we see this overall, and I think the US government, unfortunately, is providing cover and excuse for a lot of that. So it really has to come from civil society. And I wonder, Joan, if you can talk a little bit about, if you look at the US or the Americas more generally, civil society, what can it contribute? How should it better organize? And how should it be? One of the things that you mentioned is the WPS agenda still has a knowledge problem and a perception problem. And so that is probably one of the big tasks also of civil society.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, first, I don't think we can totally write off what the government is doing. Government agencies, US government agencies were doing women, peace and security before there was a Women, Peace and Security Act, before there was a National Action Plan. But it just wasn't called women, peace, and security. In the military, it was often through security cooperation programs, and it was mostly over there. And I think still within different pockets of the military, they want to keep doing that because it benefits them. The Army still has 1,000 gender focal points and advisors. And I think what's happening is, and it has to go to civil society as well, is you have to read the room, read the market, and adapt. So, for example, when I talk to military audiences now, I don't say women, peace, and security. I say, and Karen was there when we talked about this, that we need to take a whole of society approach to conflict and security. And everybody goes, yeah, well, I'm talking women, peace, and security. It's like people are adamantly against Obamacare, but they think the ACA is great. It's the same thing, you know. So we need to think about our wordage. We need to think about how we market. And I think for civil society, we need to educate. You can't have a movement if people don't know what you're talking about. My own example of that is I noticed in my women, peace, and security classes, it was 90% women, 10, and look at the audience, the same thing, 90% women, 10% men. How did I reach this male audience that I really needed to convince as allies? So I took a big chunk of the gender and security part of the course, put it into a leadership course called Leadership in War and Peace. And now it's 90% men and 10% women. And so I think we love talking to ourselves, but we need to talk to others and really start that education on a much, much broader level.
Okay. Let me open it up to questions from the room. Yes, Renata.
First of all, thank you for the presentations, for bringing the different perspectives of different regions. I'm Renata Giannini, I'm a professor here, but before all that, I'm Brazilian. I've been working on national action plans in Brazil and in Latin America for a really long time. And one of the main things that I noticed, this disconnect that we're talking about, this branding problem, it's of course it's very problematic, but it takes different forms in different region. So just as an example, in Brazil, when we had an administration very similar to the current one here, women, peace, and security was not affected at all because the perception was that this is about women in the military. That's all. It's all about increasing women. It's nothing else. Because that was the perspective, that was not it was not attacked. But at the same time, if you look at the kind of challenges that that particular region confronts, social environmental conflicts that are not really considered as conflicts, even though they have pretty similar consequences. You have parts of different states completely dominated by organized crime with harsh consequences. These issues are not included in the national action plans. And that's why civil society often feel disconnected with the agenda. So my question is basically, how do we strengthen these connections among civil society groups across different regions? We have the language barrier, there are funding challenges, but I think that's the way, and it's also a way to strengthen the agenda. And one last question is the way, because I thought at the time that the way to make this agenda legitimate in Latin America was to make it wider, to make people understand that protecting the Amazon, the environmental defenders there, is part of the women, peace, and security agenda. Now I'm not that sure, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on this, because I often think that sometimes when we make it too big, we also make it about nothing, and now I'm not sure if the choice was correct at the time. Thank you.
Very good question. I think you have two questions there. Is one, how do we build that global movement? And on the other hand, what should the WPS agenda be about, really? And should it connect to all these other policy agendas like, climate change, the SDGs, etc.? I don't know if, yes, Ninar, you want to?
Thank you for your question. I've been thinking a lot about the legitimacy, excuse me, the legitimacy of WPS, especially in the Middle East. I worry about how WPS is perceived now in the Middle East due to the war on Gaza and the immense impact it's had on women and girls. 67% of those killed in the conflict have been women and girls by some estimates. And of course, including, as we know from the WPS agenda and several resolutions, women and girls are facing bearing the disproportionate brunt of conflicts all around the world. And we see that particularly right now in Gaza. And why that connects to legitimacy is that if WPS is perceived as a Western and institutional framework, then that will be rejected almost immediately because Palestinian society and the global Middle Eastern, North African society has seen the way in which the war in Gaza has been talked about, not only in international institutions, but particularly by Western nations. So that's something that I worry about quite a lot. But I think civil society is the future and is increasingly the future because of, like we also heard in the earlier panel, how precarious global funding is right now. Not only the dismantling of USAID, but development as a sector is in a very dire situation at the moment. I really like the idea of creating independent WS funds. I like the idea of network building, information sharing. 83% of women-led organizations in Gaza are continuing to operate despite Israeli bombardment and despite this very fragile ceasefire with every day some new violations of the ceasefire. I think maybe moving away, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but moving away from, you know, strictly institutionalization of WPS and seeing that it's already playing out on the ground, we need to reassess how, like you said, Joan, how we communicate the kind of central themes and ideals of WPS because it is being practiced on the ground. It is just seen as delegitimate because of it's seen as a Western concept, and the West has really let Gazan women, Palestinian women, Arab women down generally. So that's what I've been thinking about that a lot.
Dia, do you want to say a few words about civil society in Africa? Because I actually don't think the WPS agenda was a Western agenda. It's actually in Africa that started. Dia?
Yeah, yes, I agree. The WPS agenda is not a Western agenda because it actually is from liberation movements that we had in spaces in Africa. And for us, we use the fact that women participated in liberating the countries that we come from during the colonial times. And WPS agenda is actually fulfilling a promise at the end of the day, because even after the liberation processes had completed and most of the countries had had independence, women continued to participate in building these new countries that were coming on board. So it has lived through history. For someone who builds networks, who has been doing this for a while through the Sisters Without Borders, which is across different regions, I think we sometimes have the assumption, and I think it's one of our unconscious biases that we have, is when women or communities come from across the border from us, and we may have the language barrier, so it becomes difficult to build across different countries. The experiences I've had is engaging on WPS itself, and I actually really advocate and say WPS agenda is all about multilateralism at the end of the day, because all the 4 pillars actually are speaking to multilateral engagement. And when we are looking at across borders, engaging across borders, it's you find the issue of identity comes in. You find women on either side of the borders, be it doing economic activities, engaging in, even directly peace and ceasefire related interventions, even though they may not be very formal. And what is usually lacking is when you go into those communities and between one border and the other border, you realize what they needed is that opportunity to come together and learn from each other and then invigorate each other as they co-create what they want to do next. And we've seen this severally using their network. We had this really robust peace caravan during the electioneering process that we women drove from Uganda all the way to Zanzibar, which is almost like 1,000+ kilometers, and spent almost 11 days as we stopped in different towns across the different countries. And we were united by the call at the end of the day, which is about peace, which is about reimagining how we look at security. And this is the humanizing element. And I really like what Alexandra has mentioned, that we moved away and started becoming and having an over focus on the military security, and really moving away from the centrality of human security. And for us, it was even having that conversation and bringing it back to the echelons of society, which is all about having that sense of safety to walk from your house to even the school and feel safe to walk from point A to point B, being able to go out and earn a living, being able to speak even online, where we see a lot of online harassment, being able to put across your messaging. And where do I find hope? To me, is how we are translating the WPS agenda and the YPS agenda. This is the youth, peace, and security. Young people are actually embedding a part of the values, I would say, of the WPS agenda. You see the discussions around equality, dignity, safety. They want voice, they want accountability. And we see it across Africa, which is really amongst the youngest as you all know, we are going to have the most young group of people over time, you know. And what I notice is it's moving away from interest in WPS. It's more like, how do we translate some of the language which sometimes is felt to be too bureaucratic? And this was seen, you know, as the WPS initially was coming into play, into one that they can be able to help with bridging as we co-design, I would say, for the next 25 years. The WPS agenda and the YPS agenda have a lot that they can learn from each other. And this really gives me hope. And I find it as another entry point of conversation, because WPS agenda taught us the importance of moving also from process to really turning these things into systems, and so that it can last, get the funding, the budgets, and the outcomes we see. And the WPS agenda, the YPS agenda, coming into play now after a decade of pushing for the WPS, and we see a lot of their YPS agendas being nationalized, is also supporting to include the WPS in that, so that they too can help with turning this into systems beyond just the processes. And I think we see that quite a bit. We are moving away, especially in the countries I serve, from just the, I would call it the post-conflict peace table, to having conversations around mental health, having conversations around online safety, and so on. And so it's becoming a continued lived documentation, a continued lived strategy at the end of the day. And as most people would tell you, it's one of the most advocated UN resolution at the end of the day. I keep hearing that of all the 3,000+ resolutions, the WPS agenda really had a robust advocacy. It's discussed quite intensely in different spaces. So to me, there is hope with it, as long as we find ways to make sure that, you know, we live with the values that we preset at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fuzia. Let me reopen it. Yes, in the back. I have two, maybe we'll take a few questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Sia. I'm a student at the Elliott School, and I'm also involved in the WPS consortium here. Thank you so much for your insights on the panel, first of all. I was especially intrigued by your point, Professor Fries, on the point of the branding problem. And so I was curious on how you would maybe apply this idea to developing countries. And so do you think that developing countries need maybe a cultural or a societal shift in how they perceive and treat women to enact this visible branding? Or can the strategic marketing that you mentioned help enable that cultural shift? Or is it maybe a blend of both?
Hold your fire for a moment. Give the mic to the woman in front of you.
Hello, hi. I'm Lacey. I am also a student at Elliott. I'm in the MAI program, so hi. I had a quick question about trying to create a framework, a cultural framework in your respective regions that outlasts the unique challenges of those regions and democratic backsliding, but still cultivates a global network of support. I know that the approaches have to be different and unique in themselves, but are these different approaches something that we could unify under a single movement, or does that disvalidate those approaches?
And then we'll do a second round. Please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Doha. I'm a global development strategist. My question is primarily for Ninar, but I welcome anybody to answer. I think as you have discussed during this panel, there is this global north aspect to women, peace, and security. And a question that was just asked, the first one is, how do, in the global south, we change the narrative around this? But Ninar, you said that like this has always existed in the global south. And so the question I want to build on from that and from what you said is that as the Middle East continues to experience these complex and interesting crises, intersecting crises, women have remained steadfast, right? As we know, as community leaders, peace builders, and advocates. So want you to speak in any way of like how, despite these ongoing crises and narrowing space for civil society, are they continuing to serve as agents for hope and resilience? So just maybe end on a positive note of like what we're already seeing.
Maybe I'll take the gentleman there. We'll just collect a number. The gentleman and the woman will take a number of questions.
Oh, thank you. My name is Nuhan. I'm from Guinea. I am an independent consultant in leadership development and women empowerment. I do not have questions. I have some remarks regarding the success of the program. I think everybody, since centuries, we are experiencing a constant, a constant failure of these programs, especially in Africa. I will give you for my understanding, three main reasons. The first reason is the lack of reaching the grassroots and the cultural legitimacy. What I mean by that, because most of the program that is implemented in Africa, they go as one fit all. However, each African country is unique. Within each African country also, one fit all doesn't apply to each country, any country in Africa. If you go to any country in Africa, regions, even prefecture, you will see the divide based on the tribes. So if you have a plan, you have a schedule, you have any program that goes from one fit all at the global level, and you go to the grassroots in Africa, you will be failing. There's no doubt in that. You will fail because the first thing is the cultural legitimacy. Our culture, we see your program as against them, as taking their power and taking their authority from them. So for me, what the plan should be, we just go to listen to them. You come to my house to help me, and you come to tell me, okay, in your house, you need to change your table, you need to change this, you need to do this. You do not listen to me. You don't care about what I need. You just come to me to do what you want me to do. I will take your money. However, when you leave, when you come back, you will see the same mess. So the second point is I can talk without to make my.
But maybe very briefly, because
Very
the
short.
time is running out.
Yeah, sure.
so-
The second point is the political challenge. In the African countries, our political situation is not stable and they are not strong enough. So wherever we do at the global level, if the political environment is not stable and strong, it will be hard. The third cause is the heavy top overhead international for any program. For example, if you give $1,000 and almost $70,000 will be dismissed in the bureaucracies, and how much go to the root? And also, people go tell about the language barrier. Why the language barrier? Because if I go to my village, I already know the culture. I already know how the village is. If you come to my village, they don't see you as a helper, they see you as a provider, as a provider of money. So they listen to you, but wherever you say to them, their money is not with you. They just care about what you got in your hands.
Okay, thank you, sir. Could you give the mic to the woman next to you, and then we'll go back to the.
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Cornelia Weiss, and I'm quite concerned about the rhetoric here that WPS is a Western concept. If you look at the history, who was the sponsor of 1325? It was Namibia, okay? They were the pen holder. You look at civil society, right? I see shocked faces, right? Why has no one heard this, right? So I've published about this. It should be known by every single person here. You look at civil society. We hear about civil society. Was that primarily Western based? No, the majority of the individuals in society fighting for 1325 were not North American. They were from other parts of the world, okay? To include absolutely not Europe. Do you know what Europe? They had a similar thing like WPS, and you know what they did? They tabled it, they put it away, okay? So understand. And then we talk about the youth. Well, go back to 1999, Namibia again. Wow, they also do the first thing for children in conflict. So let's get away from this rhetoric and this understanding that 1325 is a Western concept. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cornelia. Let me go back to the panel. Let me start with Joan about the framing issues.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely true. And we talk about this in terms of security cooperation. One size fits one. What works in one country doesn't work in another country. There are political, cultural, social, economic factors which make it imperative. So this idea that we can have one approach and it's going to work everywhere, I think is a fallacy. The idea of it being a Western, and you've certainly negated that, but if the perception is that it's Western, perception becomes reality. So how do we dispel the perception? One of the ways I think we do that is we don't, I don't want to say value, we don't publicize, we don't talk enough about what other countries are adding. In Brazil, I was recently at one of the women's houses talking about gender-based violence and how Brazil is approaching it. Why aren't we talking about that more? It's a fabulous approach. In Kenya, Solar Sisters, women's empowerment, economic development, sustainability. We think of it as Western because the money has come from the West and gone elsewhere, but it's not just the money, it's the lessons learned. When we talk about peace building, what do we study? Ireland, Northern Ireland. We studied Liberia. So it's looking and valuing and emphasizing more the contributions from other countries, which started much sooner and much more from civil society.
Alexandra, let me go to you. In terms of particular civil society in Europe, do you see civil society in Europe coming together? Particular maybe also in view.
Yes. We work together. For example, together with Germany, we have published security index. It was very popular among European countries. It was index about gender gap in politics, in military and police forces, in diplomacy. We work together across mentoring programs. For example, in Poland, twice Poland introduced mentoring program in cyber and mentoring program in security and defense sector, and it was utilized also in Italy. Very often we share information about what is happening. We ask questions about national action plans. So we use academic platforms as well. I represent academia, so for me it's busy. However, my students, they know that Namibia was the impulse for resolution 1325 because I have introduced at my university 5 years ago the lecture Women, Peace and Security. You have mentioned here about knowledge and awareness. I couldn't force Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Chancellery of Prime Minister to launch campaign about WPS. So I used tools at the university to promote knowledge among students from every kind of faculties. So there are tools, there are possibilities. However, costs are enormous, and very often our budgets, our private budgets, they are in this WPS agenda promotion, and sometimes, of course, it hurts. I'm afraid that nowadays I observe that WPS agenda has got tendency to securitize women, to use women for military and defense tools. And it's to observe, especially within the European Union corridors towards the Ukrainian-Russian conflicts. And also the first shift to it was to observe in 2015 when we had this resolution about anti-terrorism efforts. So these tools, this perspective can be used to marginalizing civil society voices, this anti-terrorist turn. So, of course, WPS agenda nowadays, it doesn't win our hearts. However, it is worth to be put on the table and to be living document as well. So in many civil society activities in Europe, in the European Union states, WPS agenda, it's only a part of our activity. It is not a core anymore.
Okay, thank you. Nina?
Chantal, just to be clear, I did not mean that WPS was born in the West. I know very well it was born in Africa and the global South. And as I've said, it is practiced every day by women globally. But like Joan said, when the perception is that it is Western, then we need to regroup, re-strategize. Autocrats in the Middle East are very, very, very happy to say this agenda or any sort of inclusionary agenda is something imposed on them by the West in a sort of conspiratorial manner of thinking. After October 7, the opportunity for that increased tenfold. So this is what we have to grapple with at the moment. And don't forget, global narratives inform each other. I remember when Ron DeSantis had his moral panic a few years ago about gender and sexual minorities, Erdogan was saying that these ideologies will never, quote unquote, infect us here in Turkey. So these leaders talk to each other, their ideas inform each other. So when the perception is that it's Western, even if it's not, that creates a new barrier for us, especially now during the Gaza war. So to answer the first question on cultural frameworks, and I agree with Joan, they have to fit society in which we hope WPS will be practicing. We don't want to give even more ammunition that this is something imposed on the outside and something that does not respect local cultures. But like I said, women are practicing that on the ground. So instead of a top-down approach, information dissemination can and should and is happening from the bottom up. Very quickly on the second question, this is a time of immense challenges for the Middle East. Unfortunately, there's a perception that laws and norms have eroded. Israel struck Doha, the capital of Qatar, last month, which shook the Gulf, shook even the US. There's a perception that some countries want want the Middle East to de-escalate, want to focus on economic diversification, prosperity, but there's the persistence of non-state armed actors. There's a persistence of spoiler actors like Israel and Iran that is causing anxiety throughout the Middle East, even when they're posturing that they are ready for de-escalation. And finally, like I said, a very perilous time for international development, international funding, and key institutions that have been partners and have had expertise in the past are now, out of jobs. There's no funding. So this is a very perilous time, but it is also a transformative time and a time of opportunity. We've seen just in the last year the fall of Bashar al-Assad, a vicious, vicious regime in Syria that has victimized many, many women and girls. We've seen the weakening of Hezbollah. We've seen the weakening of non-state armed groups in the region as a whole. And now we see a very fragile ceasefire. So we are at a perfect opportunity now when we are looking towards stabilization in the Levant, stabilization in Syria, Lebanon, and hopefully Gaza. This is the time to include women not only in peace talks and negotiations. No women were involved in the current negotiations, as far as I'm aware. But in terms of stabilization, in terms of including them as technocrats, in terms of including them not only for not providing only immediate support, but integrating them as should be normal into every step of governance in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and other conflict zones around the Middle East. So it is a very dire time, but it's also a very unique and transformative time where old orders are subsiding, new ones are emerging, and grassroots women's organizations are already doing the work. It is up to us on the outside now to support them by resources, funding, and narrative support as well.
Thank you, Nina. I think indeed all of you, including in the first panel, have really called for that mobilization of civil society. And I think that is really necessary. And then the trick is going to be, how are we connecting all these civil society movements? Because we have to do it. The local cannot live without the global, and the global cannot live without the local. And we do not have to put them into contradiction. On the contrary, they are complementary. And I think to all of us, it's upon us to create this big new social movement. There can be a focal point, like for instance, the treaty. And in terms of the agenda, Renata, do we focus narrowly or do we go broad? Well, maybe there's also some kind of middle way. And I think it depends also a little bit on the region where you are. Security challenges change because ultimately what is the WPS agenda about? It is about peace and security, and the notion that you can't have peace and security without gender equality. And that is true for all countries in the world, the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And so I'd like to thank our panelists for helping the discussion. And I look to you for mobilization.